I'd like to welcome everyone to the Gayaa Dhuwi Proud Spirit Australia webinar on the National Agreement on Closing the Gap Policy Partnerships. It's my honour to welcome everyone here. I'd also like to acknowledge all the different countries that you may be ringing in from. I'm ringing in personally from Nyunga, that's in Perth in Western Australia, and I'd like to acknowledge all our elders, past, present and emerging. I'd like to also acknowledge our continuing culture, the strength of our continuing culture and resilience of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander social and emotional wellbeing. Today we have a wonderful webinar on the National Agreement on Closing the Gap Policy Partnerships, and the one that Gayaa Dhuwi is particularly responsible for is social and emotional wellbeing. My name is Pat Dudgeon. I'm a research professor at the Transforming Indigenous Mental Health and Wellbeing research project at the University of Western Australia. Importantly, I am a director on the board of Gayaa Dhuwi Proud Spirit Australia, and in that role I'm the co-chair on the National Agreement of Closing the Gap Policy Partnership for Social and Emotional Wellbeing. I will be giving an overview of the policy partnerships and what we expect and hope will come out of that. On social and emotional wellbeing, but there'll be other really good speakers who are part of that joint group as well, and they include people like Dr. Paul Gray from the University of Technology, Sydney. There's Mr. Zaccariah Cox, who's from the Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Services of the Kimberley area of Western Australia. Mr. Dean Baylis, who's the CEO of Healing Works Australia, and Fiona Cornforth, who is the CEO of the Healing Foundation. Okay, as stated before, my name's Pat Dudgeon. I actually live and work in beautiful Nyunga, that's in Perth in Western Australia. That's where our university and now our research project is located on. However, my people actually are from the Kimberley. I'm from the Bardi people and the Gidja people of the Kimberley. But I came here to Perth to study psychology. My background is a psychologist many, many years ago. So I've stayed in beautiful Nyunga country. A little bit now, moving on to our webinar, I'd like to just go over it very briefly, and please, you can go to the Gayaa Dhuwi website to find all this information. So if you do miss bits and pieces, do not despair, go to the website. But just a little bit about the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. Most of you would have heard about closing the gap. We've been working on that particular issue for some time, and the gap is referencing the gap of our health disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. There were lots of different government structures put in place in attempts to close the gap. They have had very limited success. So what we're seeing emerge in recent times is the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, which shows a lot of promise. And that's got a different system in place, which I'll go into directly, but closing the gap itself acknowledges the ongoing strength and resilience of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in sustaining the world's oldest living cultures. So closing the gap comes in with a strength-based approach. It's also underpinned by the belief that when we are involved and have a genuine say in the design and delivery of policies, programs and services that affect us, there will be better life outcomes. Closing the Gap also recognises that structural change in the way that governments work with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people is absolutely needed to close that gap. So what's happening differently? All Australian governments are working with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people, their communities, organisations and businesses to implement the new National Agreement on Closing the Gap. And this is happening at a national, state and territory and local level. So this is an unprecedented shift in the way governments have previously worked to close the gap. This new approach acknowledges that to close the gap, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people must determine, drive and own the desired outcomes alongside all governments. So there needs to be a genuine shared partnership, not a top-down approach, which has been our previous experience, which has not worked. So part of the national agreement is that implementation plans have been developed and delivered by each party to the national agreement in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander partners. And these set out how the policies and programs are aligned to the national agreement and what actions will be taken to achieve the priority reforms and outcomes. So these are very important new changes, and the agreement is between the Coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations and all Australian governments, and that's representatives from the relevant Commonwealth department, and then senior representatives from all state and territory governments. Our particular target being outcome being social emotional wellbeing. We come under target 14, which is a significant and sustained reduction in the suicide of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, moving towards zero suicide. So one of the most significant outcomes to achieve that is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people must enjoy high levels of social emotional wellbeing. There's a whole range of different indicators that need to be looked at in order to, and a lot of work that will be done. We'll need to disaggregate all that data coming in from a Commonwealth and state perspective. Also looking at, regional and remote areas where, considering the socio-economic status of local groups, gender and age group. So, we know that there's twice the rate of Indigenous suicides to other Australians, but we know that behind that there's a whole range of different factors that we believe leads to that. Some of these are clinical, but often they are socio-economic, and I'll speak about a bit more about that later. Our policy partnership will look at all the data, and we'll be exploring all the options to measure and report against all the different issues that make up Indigenous wellbeing. We base our social emotional wellbeing definition on one that has been a part of the last mental health and social emotional wellbeing framework. And this is used by many Aboriginal community organisations and programs, and it is moving away from a Western version of selfhood towards an Indigenous one. So we know that, for instance, it's not only our wellbeing is about our connection to our bodies and our behaviours or our mind and emotions. It also is about our connection to our family and our kinship, our connections to our community, our connections to culture, to country and land, and our connections to spirit and spirituality. This does not happen in a vacuum. So while this paradigm or perspective of wellbeing has been embraced, we recognised as well that it doesn't happen in a vacuum, but there is a history of colonisation that's impacting on us. So you'll see around the outer circles that we have got different determinants, social determinants, education, employment, racism, the classical definition of the social determinants that impact on our health and wellbeing. But for us, there's also historical determinants, and that is that history of colonisation and the need to heal and recover from that. And within that would be, institutionalised and cultural racism, which is impacting on our people all the time. There are political determinants, and that's been how the governments or the state has regarded Aboriginal people and how they have resourced or failed to resource our aspirations. And again, I think that the Coalition of Peaks Agreement signifies a significant change of approach. But there's also our culture. We are a different culture. Some of our values and aspirations and ways of doing things will be different. So there's a little bit of information on social emotional wellbeing. We will have resources available to unpack that more. A lot of our Aboriginal community controlled health organisations are already investigating how they offer social emotional wellbeing programs and services. So there's been a lot of work happening on the ground with our own people recognising that they needed a holistic approach to health, mental health or wellbeing in order to heal and empower our people. So going back to the Coalition of Peaks Policy Partnership, again, we're under Pillar 4 and Gayaa Dhuwi Proud Spirit Australia being our peak body in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership in social emotional wellbeing, mental health and suicide prevention. We're made up of a number of various groups who are concerned with Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander wellbeing. These include groups such as the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation, the Australian Indigenous Psychologists Association, the Centre for Best Practice in Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention, and so on. So all the relevant organisations make up the board of Gayaa Dhuwi Proud Spirit. So Gayaa Dhuwi Proud Spirit is the partner that will take forward the policy partnership on social emotional wellbeing, and they will be supported to do that. Just a little bit of an overview on where it all fits together. We have the policy partnership, which Gayaa Dhuwi has responsibilities for, is that there's a group of government representatives, and there's also a number of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander representatives, and there are also 5 Indigenous Coalition of Peaks representatives. Now, I'll show you the membership there, but it was a very democratic and inclusive process. So obviously we have, by the business nature of the activities they do, Coalition of Peak representatives, but a call was put out for Aboriginal community members to apply and be a part of this policy partnership. The government themselves went through their own process. Their co-chair is Tanya Richnow, and senior people were chosen from the Department of Health from all states and territories. We also have the National Indigenous Affairs Authority sitting in on the group as an observer, because they have some investments in social emotional wellbeing as well. So Gayaa Dhuwi is responsible for bringing all these people together. We've already had 2 meetings of the Indigenous group, and we've had our first joint meeting of everyone in March this year, and that has been a very successful process. So here are some of the people, some of our members, the Coalition of Peaks representatives, myself, Dawn Casey, Scott Wilson, Zaccariah Cox, Fiona Cornforth. And our independent community reps are Mr. Dean Baylis, Danielle Dial from AMSANT in Northern Territory, Donna Murray from the Indigenous Allied Health Association, Deborah Woods from the Geraldton Aboriginal Medical Service, and Paul Gray, Dr. Paul Gray from the Sydney, the University of Sydney Jambana Institute. So we've had our first meeting, and that was really exciting. It was such a positive meeting. We went during that meeting, we went through a big discussion of what social emotional wellbeing was. There were lots of other issues that came from that. You know, we saw the importance of truth telling, that we needed to go through a process of healing and recovery. So that was a fantastic discussion that we had, and then we started coming up with what was the important priorities for our policy partnership. So we came up with those. The government shared what they were doing, and more work will be put into this, I think, to start unpacking, you know, what the Commonwealth is doing and what all the states and territories are doing. So we'll start unpacking that even further as we go on. But it was good to hear what each state and territory were doing. Some very exciting initiatives are happening right across the country. So I think that we've come together at a really auspicious time of change, not just in the mental health wellbeing area, but also I think with a lot of activities like the voice happening, the states themselves initiating activities such as the Europe Truth Commission. So I think there is an unprecedented number of changes that are happening in our country, in our society, and we're coming in on top of that. So it augurs well for the future. Our big issues that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members felt was that, you know, what our immediate priority was to renew the national strategic framework on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander suicide, social emotional wellbeing. So that was the number one priority. But the number two priority was that we needed to establish an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led commissioning framework. So we needed to know what monies were being spent on social emotional wellbeing, and to ensure that those monies, that funding was going through to the Aboriginal community controlled area. So again, that echoes a big principle of the National Agreement on Closing the Gap is about self-determination and being part of decision making. So that was echoed through a lot of the conversations we had. We recognise too that even though our outcome is social emotional wellbeing, we overlap with a lot of the other areas as well. So, you know, with housing, with the justice system, with child and youth wellbeing. So that we've recognised that. And the whole thing about, I think, all the targets is the need for a workforce, not only a Indigenous workforce, but also for cultural competence in mainstream workforce. Basically, our big focus being the National Strategic Framework for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health and social emotional wellbeing. We do have a framework in place. It has not been implemented. It has never been formally implemented. Having said that, there's been changes on the ground that have taken up a social and emotional wellbeing approach. But that was a very good framework. It was well consulted. There was a huge and very rich process of consultation, but it was never ever implemented. But it kept in place the principles from way forward, and it acknowledged that we have different cultures and history and sometimes different needs. But it also recognised the strength, resilience and diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. But it had a number of different action areas: strengthen the foundation, promote wellness, build capacity and resilience in the groups at risk, care for people who are mild or moderately ill, and care for people who are living with severe mental illness. One of the issues that came out, however, during the conversation is that the group will just use the mental health won't be a part of our language when we describe social emotional well-being. It will be just social and emotional well-being. So renewing our framework, our SUV framework, will be our first big task. And I'm pretty optimistic about it. I think there's 3 big policy documents that are happening or in train, and one of them is the Gayaa Dhuwi statement and implementation plan, which is now in progress. But there's also the National Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Suicide Prevention Strategy, which Gayaa Dhuwi is currently working on. And the third big piece of work is the SUV framework. So with those 3, I believe that will really change the system and change the landscape for Indigenous wellbeing. So we've got a lot of hard work ahead of ourselves. We need to, gather information in a situation or a landscape that's very changing all the time in a positive way. We do have national social emotional wellbeing gatherings. We will be having our next one in Darwin in the Northern Territory, and alongside that, our second meeting of the Coalition of Peace Partnership will occur. But I think there's a whole movement now going towards privileging Indigenous mental health and wellbeing or wellbeing, and to start to tackle suicide. So I'm feeling pretty optimistic. I think that with those 3 major policy documents, there will be a big change in the landscape for Aboriginal wellbeing. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, and that is Dr. Paul Gray. Dr. Paul Gray leads the Indigenous Child Protection Hub at the University of Technology Sydney's Jambana Institute of Indigenous Education and Research. Welcome, Dr. Paul Gray.
Hi everybody, my name is Paul Gray and I'm a Wiradjuri man with family connections to Galari, the Lachlan River that winds through what is now known as Central New South Wales. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this important conversation on the social and emotional well-being of children and youth. I want to acknowledge that I record this on Tharawal country, near the rich lands along the Nepean River, and acknowledge their people, their elders, past and present, who have cared for this country and raised their children safe and strong for thousands of generations. I extend that to the custodians of the country that you might be joining us from today. Wherever you are on this continent, you are on Aboriginal land, land that was deemed to be empty by colonists who decided the people they saw were not people enough to worry about dispossessing or bothering with a treaty that might map the relationship between our peoples. However, I think it is fair to say that our children have always been in their gaze. Sana Nakata has observed that in Australia, the politics of childhood is predominantly about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. It turns out that the history of Australia, she writes, is a history of interventions into the childhoods of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Along with colleagues Terry Liebsman and Catherine Ellinghouse, we explored this history of settler legal intervention and control in the lives of Aboriginal children. It's been relentless, not just here, but in other nations too. We are but one step in a broader history as colonial nations honed their craft of dispossessing and disappearing Indigenous peoples. Professor Cindy Blackstock has noted this narrative permeating the US and Canadian law and governance. She says, "You did not exist until I discovered you, and you were not human, so you could not own land, so I took it, and I took you." That's how she characterized the legal frameworks in her country. And I remember hearing from an uncle from Canada as well at a conference, and him sharing a similar story from his community. And they're words that have stuck with me, and I think about them every time we're invited to take a moment of silence. He said, "Before the missions came, we were proud and we honoured our Creator with dance and prayer with our eyes to the sky. But they told us we were praying wrong, that we must bow our heads and close our eyes. When we lifted our heads, our land, and our children were gone. Contemporary systems and politics like to point to that past as though we have moved forward, but it's ongoing. We don't have to look far in contemporary debates to see it emerge, whether it's the proposed punitive responses to the crisis of youth crime, although I would argue the crime is not so much the crisis, but the disproportionate burden of social determinants of offending that are imposed on some communities, or the absurd and illogical claims about the apparent harms of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle. This is part of a long and ongoing history of settler claims about the best interest of our children. Again, as Nakata writes, I remain unpersuaded across hundreds of pages of historical records that the belief in doing good by Indigenous children was ever the priority over building and sustaining the white imaginary of the Australian nation. Because as long as these children ceased to exist, as long as they either died or could be successfully assimilated, the legitimacy of the new white Australian nation state could remain intact. In my view, contemporary child protection systems remain a lawless frontier of this violence and control. I don't mean lawless in the sense that there is an absence of legislation. There are reams of it, law and policy dedicated to the intervention in our families. I say lawless because, as the Families Culture Report has pointed out, these laws and policies are routinely not followed. And there are no consequences for not following them for decision makers. But there are consequences for our children. We see them in the outcomes for our children, including poor mental health and self-harm. We see it in the despair of our mothers and fathers, our aunties and uncles and grandparents, who are often overlooked for restoration or care, or subjected to further isolation and scrutiny, but little support. And a colleague recently shared a paper with me that, for example, noted that mothers subjected to child protection intervention are at significantly greater risk of mental ill health, relative even to mothers whose child sadly passes away. Because there is no support, just stigma, blame, and shame. And while we see numerous apologies and promises for reform, we see very little change. And I want to acknowledge the aunties and grandmothers who continue to stand up in this space, groups like Grandmothers Against Removal, who say and continue to say, what's the point of sorry if you keep doing it? Our communities have consistently called for the complete transformation of these systems. And while governments have committed to such transformation, you will, I hope, forgive my skepticism until we start actually seeing some tangible outcomes. Our communities, like our cousins in similar settler colonial societies, have been pretty consistent in what we think this transformation looks like. Self-determination, approaches that are grounded in culture, systems oriented towards prevention, to support and healing, and systems that are ultimately accountable to our communities. And I think that models of social and emotional well-being can help us understand and shape the sort of transformation that is necessary to realise a better and more holistic approach so that our children can thrive. So I want to talk through social and emotional well-being frameworks, and which I think present a holistic view for well-being and outline some of the challenges that characterise and persist within child protection systems, and how a social and emotional well-being grounded approach can support both system and practice change. But before we get there, we are, I think, assuming a few points that I just want to reiterate. First, that we all understand that child protection systems are an expression of a community's collective interest in the well-being and the futures of their children, and through them, the future of their community. Second, that we all understand developmental models outline key evidence about supporting children and families. And from this evidence, we know that relationships scaffold development. We know that culture organises the environment for development, and that this has implications both for brain development and behaviour. We know that experiences of trauma and toxic stress have implications for lifelong physical and mental well-being, and that together this outlines a generational and intergenerational process that can either promote or undermine well-being. And our models tell us about a theory of change, that we support families by reducing sources of stress, many of which are external to and beyond the control of our families, by working deliberately to strengthen core skills and promoting responsive relationships, both for children and for adults. And we also know that access to culture is a protective factor. And we know that experiences of racism are a significant source of distress. Now, one of the implications of these assumptions is that we shouldn't seek to understand First Nations children through non-Indigenous frameworks. Part of the harm of settler child protection systems has always been the imposition of non-Indigenous systems and knowledges when determining what was best for our kids. Whether it was the Australian idea of smoothing the dying pillow of Aboriginal peoples, or the North American, to quote, kill the Indian, save the child, settler approaches to what's best for our children have been and remain deeply problematic. Non-Indigenous systems are not well equipped, and this is what the evidence tells us, to make good decisions about Aboriginal children and communities. Some of these challenges include things like positioning settler frames as authoritative in determining Aboriginal futures, despite the ongoing harms demonstrated through such approaches. The use of assessment processes and having undue confidence in their insights, despite the fact that these assessments are not culturally valid and often include entrenched cultural biases. We see this in structured decision-making tools, in parenting capacity assessments, and in applications of things like attachment that underpin child protection systems, but don't reflect Aboriginal worldviews. Challenges include the reliance on non-Indigenous programs, despite repeated evidence of poor cultural fit and the fact that outcomes continue to entrench poorer outcomes for Aboriginal children and families. And we continue to see systems that undervalue culture, including that they fail to see culture as a central part of how we understand safety, and more importantly, how Aboriginal children and young people understand their experience and sense of safety. And instead, we position culture as something that is potentially oppositional or in contrast to safety and well-being, or seeing the enjoyment of culture as declarative knowledge, something you know, as opposed to something you are. So if we want to improve outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, we should ground our approaches in their frameworks. The social and emotional wellbeing framework is one that I think, is a great example of this. It's been developed by First Nations scholars and practitioners as a broad and enabling model for thinking about how we can think about wellbeing differently. It starts from an acknowledgement that health is about more than just physical well-being or the individual, but is about the social, emotional, and cultural well-being of the whole community as well. It's a whole of life, whole of community, and multi-generational framework. It also reflects our understanding that individual well-being, the circumstances in which individuals thrive, is so related to collective community well-being. For each individual to thrive, the community and the environment in which they are nurtured must be optimized. And in recognizing this, it pointedly includes social, cultural, historical, and political determinants as key elements of well-being. It includes domains of well-being grounded on relationships, connection to family and kin, connection to community, to culture, to country, as well as mind, body, and spirituality, and understands these as fundamental needs that are interconnected and interdependent. It considers factors affecting well-being across the life course and across generations. Risks associated with marginalisation, forced assimilation and child removals, racism and discrimination. And it considers protective or resilience factors, active engagement in culture and community, strength in identity. This broader approach to conceptualising and understanding well-being is reflected in international evidence. So research shows that self-determination, that collective autonomy and self-governance is a key evidence-based policy setting to improve outcomes for our people. For example, the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development noted that Indigenous decision makers consistently outperform external decision makers, by which they mean non-Indigenous governments, on matters as diverse as governmental form, natural resource management, economic development, healthcare, and social service provision. Further research has outlined how cultural continuity promotes well-being and is associated with significantly reduced incidences of youth distress and youth suicide. Cultural continuity is a broad umbrella term that includes self-government, local control over health, education, policing, child welfare, access to country, and community facilities to preserve and strengthen culture. Healing, therefore, requires community-level action to recover and revitalise connections to community and to culture, self-governance. Cultural wounds require cultural medicine. In short, culture, connectedness, and collective self-determination are central to well-being and the achievement of the best possible outcomes for Aboriginal children, families, and communities. They should therefore be the foundation of our child protection systems, policies, and practice. Based on this evidence, these frameworks outline how we can do better. We can understand the developmental niche and how culture shapes development. This requires us to think differently about how we serve the needs of Aboriginal children, particularly if we're looking to intervene in their families. We can ground our approaches in a human rights framework as well, recognising that the way these frameworks specifically urge understanding of the rights of Indigenous children. We've seen this in commentary on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, in General Committee comments such as General Committee Comment 11 and General Committee Comment 14, or in the Implementation Handbook, which makes clear that the inclusion of a specific article about the right of Indigenous and minority children to culture, which is Article 30, isn't redundant, despite the fact that there are other articles that emphasise already the right to culture, the right to family, the right to community, the right to your culture, but instead is essential because it reflects the way that states have and continue to fail to uphold the cultural rights of Indigenous children. It reminds us, like Bringing Them Home did, of the need to address the social, historical, and political determinants of risk and harm. It emphasises the importance of engaging with Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal experts, with that expertise not being grounded in non-Indigenous knowledge systems, in social work or psychology traditions, which I think have already contributed to the harms experienced by Aboriginal communities, but recognising that expertise is about knowing and understanding the expectations and the knowledge and the wisdom of Aboriginal communities and what is needed for our children. That is, child protection systems should be about Aboriginal conceptual frames, defining Aboriginal systems, Aboriginal decision-making for the futures of Aboriginal children. And policy frameworks and Aboriginal-led policy frameworks provide a demonstration for how these principles can be embedded in child protection systems and practice. So let's consider, for example, the Aboriginal Case Management Policy, which was developed by the Aboriginal Peak in New South Wales, ABSEC, through direct engagement with Aboriginal communities, but also with government and other stakeholders. The principles within the Aboriginal Case Management Policy align very well, I think, with the social and emotional wellbeing framework. So we see that the ACMP positions communities as decision makers, recognising the importance of self-determination and those political determinants of wellbeing. It includes the development of community governance structures, which takes us right back to that basic foundation that these systems, these child protection systems, are an expression of our community's collective interest in the well-being of our kids. We see it in appeals to proactive efforts within these policies and the broad public health approach that they take, acknowledgement of the need to address the social determinants of well-being, albeit positioned still within the scope of child welfare. And we see it in elements that likewise centre connections with Aboriginal families, connection to their communities, and make sure that at the heart of it is an Aboriginal cultural framework. Likewise, I think the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander child placement principle, a long-standing policy that I suspect you're all familiar with, also reflects social or aligns with these social and emotional wellbeing frameworks. The fundamental goal of the child placement principle is to enhance and preserve Aboriginal children's connections to family and community and their sense of identity, their sense of connection to culture. Connection is framed as one of the 5 core elements, as is the active involvement of Aboriginal families and communities through partnership and participation elements. In being focused on prevention, it centres a holistic view of wellbeing that recognises the relationship between individual and community wellbeing, both in the whole self and the community as a whole. And I think we can apply the social and emotional wellbeing framework. So that explains, I think, some of the ways that social and emotional wellbeing frameworks can be applied in setting systems and policies to be more responsive to the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. But we can also do it, we can embed it at an individual level as well. For example, I sometimes provide support to families who are currently affected by child protection systems. And this can include helping them to participate effectively in the development of care plans. And one of the things that we noticed through this process is the way that the care plan template and process orients these conversations to the needs of the caseworker and takes on a very administrative kind of element. This is where we plug in what we're going to do about contact. And this section is where we plug in about childcare, or this is where we plug in about health checks or education or what have you. But this wasn't how the family understood or approached what their child needed. So, for example, the first field in the form was about placement and permanency, a field that largely focused on what are the legal orders that child protection agencies might pursue. And this was extremely distracting and distressing for families. We also found that these forms understood personal identity and culture very narrowly. It sort of contained them as add-ons or events, as opposed to things that are part of the everyday life, the everyday experience of children and families. And through the family's eyes, as we went through these processes, it became clear that all of these things could only be understood through a cultural frame. Their significant relationships, their children's developmental needs, all sit in the context of their culture. And so we started advocating for a different approach, one that centres the various social and emotional well-being elements, connection to body, to mind, to emotion, connection to family and kinship, connection to community, to culture and country and spirituality. And so by doing this, we deliberately aimed to centre the Aboriginal child as an Aboriginal child. We leaned into the interconnections between all of those elements. We leaned into the importance of family and community voices in decision-making. We leaned into development as a process and identity formation as a process. What Noongar academic and advocate Jacinta Krakauer referred to as a process of culturally connecting. Krakauer further argued that this should be grounded in the politics of resistance. That is, thinking about these connections not as a policy setting or a goal, but as a political claim, a claim to internationally protected human rights, the cultural rights of our children. And so we found through this process that we could reframe both what was included in plans and how we understood the needs of children, but also the expectations that were on caseworkers to uphold these rights. So we moved away from this kind of ritual of bureaucratic box ticking to actually start thinking about children in a developmental way, and thinking about their development as a process that must involve their family, their community, and must be grounded in culture. So, what I've tried to do in this conversation today is to outline some of the challenges in child protection systems, and to point to how the social and emotional wellbeing framework can help us, not as a sole framework, but as a guiding framework alongside others like human rights frameworks, to understand how we can transform child protection systems by Aboriginal communities, for Aboriginal communities, as an expression of our love and our care for our children. Because the bottom line is that child protection systems, non-Indigenous, settler child protection systems, the ones that we have now, continue to fail our children. And in my view, social and emotional wellbeing models provide one framework to inform our efforts to transform them. One that's about an approach that centers our children, their families and communities in the context of their social, historical, and political stories. It points to broader social system and practice change that value and safeguard our children's connections, and the importance of a relational worldview as a foundation to their lifelong well-being. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Paul. That was really interesting and good timing. Now we're going to have a little break. This is an opportunity for people to go and have a little stretch, grab a cup of tea and come back. But thank you, Paul, and we'll have a short break, 5-minute break, and we will indicate when it's time to come back. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice little rest. Our next great speaker is Mr. Zaccariah Cox. He's the Social Emotional Wellbeing Coordinator at the Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Service and a member of our Coalition of Peak Policy Partnership. So without further ado, welcome, Zaccariah.
So yeah, my name's Zaccariah Cox. My mob come from the Kimberley. I've got connections to the Nimambur people, which is on the eastern side of the Dampier Peninsula, north of Broome, from my great-grandmother's side, and also I've got connections through my other great-grandparents through the central Kimberley in the Gayaa area, or the Gayaa region, or tribe, or group. Which is near Halls Creek, where my grandmother was taken as a young girl, and is part of the stolen generation. Currently, I'm the Senior Social and Emotional Wellbeing and Mental Health Manager at the Kimberley Aboriginal Medical Services based in Broome, but obviously we have coverage and responsible for advocating and delivering activities and programs across the Kimberley region. I suppose in terms of the importance, I suppose at the top level, policies dictate and determine legislation and systems, I suppose, that impact on people in general. So I suppose the policy partnership is important in the first instance to be able to give us a voice or give us a say in how policies are designed and what details are in those policies, which will go a long way to having Aboriginal input in knowing and understanding where the sort of needs are and where the priorities are on the ground in terms of social and emotional wellbeing, in terms of overall health, and I suppose inequities and the disparities for many of the outcomes and inequalities, I suppose, for our mob compared to the rest of the Australian population. Yeah, I'm quite new to the I suppose policy space and taking on a leadership role within our service at CAMS. So I'm still learning as we go as well, but as I suppose as we push through, it'll give me an opportunity to be able to understand how sort of policy sort of flows on and has that ripple effect or that flow-on effect in terms of health, the health outcomes or the health opportunities for people to access health services, and I suppose have that input in understanding the context of the environment and the cultural circumstances on the ground here in Broome, and for my mob, I can speak for my mob, and obviously I don't speak for all Aboriginal people across the Kimberley, but I definitely will be feeding back the information that's shared with me from what I hear from towns and communities and the different groups across the region in terms of how they might envision policy or future policy as we move through the partnership process. To I suppose meet the needs on the ground where we know there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of the healing that needs to happen. There's a lot of inequality in terms of access to education, to employment, to health. We know in the Kimberley that in accessing health, a lot of our mob prefer to use Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations or access Aboriginal community-controlled services in general, because obviously they're usually familiar with the people who work there. They're familiar with the organisation in the first instance, and they feel that they can have some sort of trust and some sort of understanding and I suppose good feeling, we call it Leon up here, in terms of accessing whichever service they need to in regards to health, I suppose, in particular, where we know there's a lot of AMSs that are established across the nation, there's 4 in the Kimberley, across the four major towns, not including Fitzroy Crossing, but we're working closely. CAMS is working closely with the Fitzroy community to be able to design and put in place a new AMS in Fitzroy, which has come direct as a call from the community to have their own Aboriginal medical service in Fitzroy. So I suppose I've covered a bit about the importance and the impact. I think, in terms of closing the gap, definitely this is a starting point with the reviewed closing the gap targets, priority reform areas, and obviously the targets. I think the last attempt didn't go as well as I suppose government and mob had hoped. So there's a lot of improvements that need to be made for the current CTG targets, and I suppose the policy partnerships are an important part to that process in being able to sit down with leaders across Australia, Aboriginal leaders with regard to the Sioux policy partnership. We've got some amazing people currently on board there, and obviously First Nations representatives as well. So that's the partnerships, I suppose, are a really integral component to be able to support this closing the gap strategy or target, I suppose, the overall closing the gap agreement to be able to better meet and or strive to meeting those targets. So the strategies for strengthening collaboration between stakeholders to ensure the effective implementation of the national agreement. So I suppose one of the strategies is having the partnership, the 5 strategy or the 5 partnership areas, and obviously social and emotional wellbeing being one of them. Some strategies, I suppose, for improving stakeholder collaboration is obviously having people who are committed and passionate involved in the first instance. As I said, I'm quite new to the leadership and sort of governance level space, and working with alongside deputy ministers, secretariats, all those types of high level roles. So I suppose learning myself and also understanding how these different types of government systems and agencies operate, and going back to, I suppose, what I was trying to say was having that investment and commitment from government, and as well as Aboriginal leaders and Aboriginal representatives from across Australia, having that commitment from all parties who are currently involved, and any sort of further involvement from any other people or agencies or organisations. I think commitment is sort of at the heart or is at the foundation of any sort of relationship or any collaboration, to show any effectiveness for implementation of meeting the targets within the agreement. I also think being transparent and sharing developments within the policy space or the partnership space with our respective, or for myself, with our respective places of employment, sharing it back to our organisations, to current governance and operational structures that we have in place already, such as working groups and other sort of working parties or subgroups that are already in place to oversee the delivery of services across our region. So building or including those stakeholders as well, and recognizing and ensuring that they are made to feel like which they are important as well, and we have responsibility to obviously share back with our communities, with especially our communities and the people on the ground, what's happening in the soup space, what developments there are, sort of what information that we're giving back to the partnership that they've given to us, that we've passed on, and sort of what the outcomes of those discussions and that sort of that information being shared to the partnership, sort of what responses and what we're doing as a partnership, and what the collective sort of closing the gap groups are doing, and the parties that are the joint councils, I suppose, as well, what responses and sort of what actions are being taken to reflect what the people and what the community might be telling us. On a side note, I think I'm supportive of the voice, and I think the voice will go a long way to supporting the implementation of the national agreement. So obviously not enforcing my opinions on other people or other mob, but really sort of sharing the truthful information around the voice and what the design of it is intended to do, and where it's meant to, how it's meant to function, and sort of what responsibility the voice has to be able to build on the build on it, or taking that step, taking those small steps forward to obviously have to allow our Aboriginal people now more of a say in terms of what happens for our mob and how it happens, and decisions that are made with people who understand the reality and the practicality of what's happening on the ground in some of our communities, and with some of our most vulnerable people and populations across the nation, and especially up here in the Kimberley with quite some very remote communities with not a lot of options, or not a lot of opportunity in community, in our remote communities, in terms of employment, education, all those factors that we have known for a long time, and that we still know that we're still advocating for, and sort of striving to get more investment to be able to address those areas on the ground in the places and with the populations where we know it's most needed. So the voice, I think, will definitely support if it gets up the implementation of the national agreement, definitely as well. So, and ensuring the right people are, that the community elected people are the members of the voice committee, or whatever title that voice arrangement is going to be. Ensuring that the community have a say in what leaders will represent the mob as well at that forum. If it gets up, which we obviously hope it does, as another step forward to trying to address the disparities between our mob, Aboriginal people, and obviously the rest of the country. So I suppose it just it depends on what barriers are becoming apparent, or what sort of issues and challenges are arising as we work through the partnership. Not sort of being too reactive, I think, when barriers do present themselves, taking a proactive approach to ensuring that they're well thought out in terms of how we can tackle those, or how we can address barriers. I think the status quo barriers that we for our mob that we already are aware of and are knowledgeable about, in terms of racism, in terms of systemic failures and systemic problems. We know that whilst government departments or agencies and any companies and businesses and any sort of industry come with their own sort of sometimes with their false sort of understandings and ideas about thinking that they know best for our mob. So sort of making it clear that that people don't talk for us, and again, back to what I said before, ensuring that Aboriginal people don't speak for all Aboriginal people. We can speak for our own mob, or I can speak for my own mob. And if we are talking or speaking from a collective standpoint, then ensuring we've got that permission from community elders and leaders from different groups to be able to do that. So ensuring that we are following our own cultural protocols in the first instance as well, and also holding ourselves to account, holding other government agencies and departments and systems as well, making sure that I suppose we're all accountable to reduce barriers from manifesting in the first place. But I think also and I'll keep saying this, identifying best practice is by being community driven and community led and speaking on behalf of the community, obviously when you have that permission, and coming across from the collective opinions and from the collective themes that are identified in our towns and communities about where people feel the priority areas are in terms of addressing mental health problems, addressing suicide prevention, and where the investment needs to be in terms of cultural programs, language programs, alternative education methods and pathways and mechanisms for our young kids who are who we know in some of our communities and towns struggle to understand and struggle to sort of fit in with the Western style of education. And I suppose that's where it all starts for young people is going to school to understand how the Western world operates and how the Western world works in the first instance. It hasn't been that long since the referendum, and I think the 67 referendum where Aboriginal people obviously had rights to vote, but I think sometimes the ignorance and arrogance is clear as day in terms of non-Indigenous Australians, not all obviously, but thinking that we have the same rights and opportunities as the rest of Australians. Why are we still seeing all these problems and all these issues within our communities and societies? But we have to remind people that it hasn't been that long since the 67 referendum where people were allowed to vote. And our mob are still trying to learn how to fit in the Western world, and also trying to learn within themselves how to balance their cultural obligations and balance that to fit in and to work alongside living in a Western society that is quite ruthless, I suppose. So, ruthless in a sense these days, in terms of how we need to live, or how we're told to live, or how we're expected to live, and how we are and how we live our day-to-day lives, and have to work and earn a living to be able to support ourselves, to feed ourselves, to buy a car to get around. We have to buy a house. All these sort of things that sort of when you think about it, that it doesn't come naturally for our mob to think that way, because as I said, we're transitioning into an area now where a lot of our mob are and do function well and balance cultural and Western sort of living, I suppose, in a way. But a lot of our mob have been left behind because of the failures of governments and the failures of investing in services and programs and activities on the ground that would have and could have supported would have and could have supported to sort of reduce the burden and sort of the dysfunction that we're seeing at the moment, I suppose, on the ground in some towns and communities across Australia. Opportunities for innovation and co-design. I suppose co-design's the go-to term of recent times in terms of our research and partnerships when delivering or developing programs for Aboriginal people. But a good close brother and family friend and family brother boys of mine recently spoke to me the other day about co-design. And is it co-design, or can we just design from our own mob because we know what we need to do in the first place? So I think co-design sort of refers to that co-design between governments and Aboriginal communities or Aboriginal services to develop and deliver health and wellbeing services and whatever it may be, education services or employment sort of services, Whereas I think whilst I believe co-design is important as well, if there is if that is taking place and sort of that's what the government are offering for whatever area it's happening in. But I also think we need to be mindful that our mob can design. We've got the expertise. These days we've got lawyers, we've got doctors, we've got teachers, we've got qualified professionals with expertise, and we also have our own mob who mightn't have those technical qualifications, but they have their own lived expertise and their own lived knowledge to be able to support our own sort of design. I'm trying to think of a word or a term to explain that, but our own. We can design things ourselves as well for our own mob without having to have two or I think being more than one, I suppose, one involvement or more than one stakeholder involvement. So we can design things ourselves, and like I said, we know we have the know-how, and especially when it comes back to those cultural and cultural knowledge and culture being at the core of who we are as Aboriginal people, and culture and language. We definitely have the capability to be able to, if given the opportunity, I suppose, to design whatever it may be. If it's a health service, if it's a on-country program to support people who are in rehab or whatever it may be. We have the design expertise within our own mob as well to be able to make that happen, I think. So that's just a bit about co-design. Innovation, again, and that comes back to innovation. Whilst innovation is great, I don't think our mob need to be too innovative, because we know what works for us. It's just, I think there needs to be more trust, I suppose, and more belief from governments that our own knowledge has been there since the beginning, since the what they call it here in Broome, the Yaro language. I hope Yaro mob don't mind me using their language. They call it the Bulgarigara, which is the creation time. It's so we've had that knowledge since the creation time, and so we don't necessarily need to be innovative because that knowledge is already there. I think governments need to be innovative in reflecting and committing to trusting and believing in what we know works for our mob, I suppose. So I suppose, for example, some may think the embedding traditional healing services within hospital is innovation, but to me it's not innovation. We know that's been a part of healing and cultural care for our mob for thousands of years. So it's not really innovation. I think it's just a new way of doing things, and possibly innovative from a government lens, not from our mob, and again, but those and importantly, we with those just on traditional healing and cultural healing practices, we've got a lot of our old people who have that knowledge and who know those practices are getting quite old now, and many have passed, and also some have passed recently as well. So I pay my respects to all those elders and knowledge holders who we've lost and who've passed on already. And there's not many of those knowledge holders with that expertise in terms of knowing and being able to teach those cultural ways of healing and traditional ways of looking after people. So we really need to be mindful of that, and we really need to be serious, I suppose, about doing something about it to ensure that that knowledge is passed on before it's too late, I suppose. And we know how that can be done. I suppose it's just a matter of getting that investment to allow it to happen. I often like to come back to common sense in terms of addressing the disparities with health for our mob. and this is just my opinion, obviously, but we can see where the problems are in terms of young people who have gone off the rails. In most instances, or most circumstances, there's been a breakdown, or there's been issues, or there's been relationship problems for those young people who are acting up with their parents. So their parents might necessarily have been there for them, and so that's a really fundamental part of life, is for young people, especially young kids, is having their parents obviously nurture and care for them, but having their parents make them feel important. I think every kid desires and pines, I suppose, to feel like there's somebody to their parents. And I think, unfortunately, that's been lost in some of our family systems over the years. And it's not the fault of the parents, obviously. It's not the fault of the kids. It's just the result of I suppose, systemic issues, government policies and practices that have had this roll-on effect to not taking up the responsibility to realize and understand and listen to our people, and our other leaders who've been saying this for tens of 20s of years, if that's even a word. And I think so. Being innovative in the sense of being open and realistic in terms of providing services and programs that might, that will likely need to work with parents and their kids to address a multitude and a range of issues that is going to take time to heal and for things to get better. So I think, it comes back to sort of what we see and what we know, or where's the starting point to be able to start to explore and try and unpack, especially families who've been broken, and families especially who've experienced suicide, and families who have I suppose a history of mental health problems and issues. But yeah, using a bit of common sense is how we try to operate here in terms of understanding and knowing what people need at a certain point in time, but also understanding and knowing that when there is all this hurt and pain and trauma and family breakdown, that it's going to take quite a bit of time and quite a bit of time and investment and actual care, or actual people showing that they care for any change to be able to happen. I feel so. A lot of services are ad hoc and are time constrained, and often there's no flexibility. There's no allowances to do things such as taking people out on country for healing sessions and healing days, fishing, hunting, camping, with the fire and stuff, all these common sense things that we know is important and healing for us, but there's currently no sort of funding that allows it, or that would allow it enough and for a period of time for that to sort of have any major or any long-term impact on individuals and families. Because I think contracts or government, most of our contracts come from government. They might see it as staff are just going out to support ourselves by hunting and fishing or camping or having a holiday. But those are the places and those are the times around the campfire at night when if you're doing intensive work with individual or even a family. Those are the times where it's most likely that people will start to explore and open up on how they really feel, and to help to unpack where the problems are coming from, and those will open up the opportunity to be able to address those and talk about where people, or what they can be doing, or how they feel they can improve their lives, and what can change to support making things better for our mob. So that's again, it's not really innovation. It's not really anything new. It's just having that, again, common sense about what we know will, I suppose, what does work for our mob. Being innovative in terms of designing and developing programs that are place-based and community-led, to be able to reflect what that community is saying is going to work for them, I suppose. So being innovative and understanding that contracts and KPIs and targets which is the way that contracts usually work, it's probably not going to work when you're designing programs on the ground. The funds just need to be there and the work needs to be done, and it can be so powerful, I suppose, and the outcomes can be so amazing.
Thank you, Zach. That was absolutely interesting, and it's so good to have your insights from the Kimberley and working out there in the community. So thank you, Zach. And I'll move on to our next speaker now. We've got Mr. Dean Baylis. He's the CEO of Healing Works Australia, and he travels right across the country imparting his training and wisdom. So without further ado, welcome, Dean, and we're looking forward to hearing your insights.
Yeah, yama, everybody. I'm Dean Baylis. I'm a proud Gomeroi man from the Northwest Slopes and Plains. I'm the CEO of Healing Works Australia, which is an organisation that does social emotional wellbeing and suicide prevention work within communities. We also work with organisations to do cultural mentoring and clinical supervision for staff. So thank you for listening to me today, and it's a proud privilege for me to represent you as an independent representative of the Policy Peaks Partnerships. I go to communities. I've actively engaged over 40 communities last year all over Australia. So I hear the voices and I take those voices seriously when I sit in these meetings and share what I hear to the people and to help with these decision making. Well, the difference between this policy partnership and the past ones is this isn't a seat at the table or a reference group. This is actually shared decision making with governments to make clear and decisive decisions and to get better outcomes for our people, for Close the Gap moving forward. This hasn't been precedented before, and I'm very excited to see how this works with government. So to get effective strategies with stakeholders, we need to sit down and look at the way commissioning has been done, what their implementation of the Close the Gap is, and hold people accountable for the priority reforms, what we're trying to achieve. In the past, there's been poor commissioning and there's been no transparency between governments and the funding bodies and who they give their money to for Close the Gap. Also, with these new targets, we want to get some redo the framework for social emotional wellbeing so we can get some clear performance indicators to ensure we're getting good outcomes. Yes, every community is different and we've got to be mindful of what that looks like, but we still need to ensure we're getting the best thing for our people. Our people deserve A1 quality support and service, and our people know how to do that for ourselves. So I'm really looking forward to implementation of a new framework, working together with this team, with the government to get these outcomes as we desire for our communities. Remembering our communities are number one stakeholder here, not government, not the Coalition and Peaks and whatever it is. So as the independent representative for the Coalition and Peaks, I take this very seriously. I sit with our communities, we listen to what their needs are. My role is to give them a voice, and remembering the community are the number one stakeholders here. Yeah, overcoming challenges and barriers is sitting in these policy partnerships without fear of pushback, without fear of having your voice heard in a really beautiful setting with government and the peak bodies and the independent representatives. We sit there sharing knowledge and coming up with true outcomes that we think our people will need. This is unprecedented. Like in the past, we've just had a voice at a table. There had been a reference group. This is no reference group. It's shared decision making. even in the last government, in the last couple of years, poor commissioning's been happening, no decision making with our people, no transparency, and these decisions are giving us poor outcomes. Within suicide, our rates are rising, and there's no accountability. No one's giving back this data, and no one at government who's giving these funds to these giant organisations are being made accountable. So moving forward, we're looking forward to these great outcomes and what that looks like. So there's been some barriers in the past of the government's holding their commitment to the priority reforms, and our 17 close the gaps outcomes we're trying to achieve. So I'm very excited of being part of this. And the first couple of meetings were outstanding. Great vibe. The government was sitting there with us. We look like some good outcomes. So we're really positive. I'm feeling I'm very positive about what this will look like. So identifying best practices. So we've got to go sit back and think about self-determination for our people, their voice, how each community has a different way of healing and what health looks like. So that's what our Aboriginal community controlled health organisations are so good at. Yes, we have a medical model, but it's specific for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. What we need to do when we identify and we develop this new framework is embed some key performance indicators so we can ensure we're getting best outcomes, and then from around there you can implement what that looks like and add things on for your own community. It's pretty exciting stuff, and the self-determination for our communities is paramount for what it looks like. So it's pretty exciting. Yes, we like people say in the past, oh yes, but it's been happening for 10 years or 20 years. Well, no, it hasn't. So yes, we've been getting funding from the for our ARCHOs, but now we've got a high importance of building the capacity of ARCHOs, building the capacity of the workforce, and ensuring we've got enough people on the ground doing the roles properly and having a framework to ensure that that can be measured, and then what that looks like for communities in their individual part, because we've got so many different laws and practices within different communities. From a rural to one in an urban society are totally different. But this is pretty exciting times. So this is exciting times here, because what we've got peak bodies from all the lead agencies in Australia. We've got independent representatives from around Australia, their minds coming together, the best practices that are happening from all of those peak bodies coming together with government, looking forward for strategies to get the best outcomes for our people. It's really outrageous. So the first meeting alone, we're just coming up, was we sat down in Adelaide a couple of months ago. I was blown away with all the knowledge in the room, but how patient everybody was. Everybody sat there and had a voice. Everybody listened and shared knowledge in a meaningful way. And then we left there with future decision making to come to the next meeting coming forward. I can already see from those meetings things being implemented from government. So it's very exciting to see what's been happening. So they're actually listening, and they're taking what we discuss as a direct partnership and moving forward fast, like actioning things to get things happening on the ground as soon as they can. This is very innovative, and the great thing is about redoing the framework, having a look at the things that were implemented a few years ago, but we weren't in the space, or we didn't have the government that could follow through for that. So I'm very excited with the Honourable Linda Burney and the team that she's pushing forward to get this great outcomes happening. We've got amazing people like Gayaa Dhuwi, Centre of Best Practice, Pat Dudgeon, you've got Paul Gray, you've got all these amazing people on board, and the future's looking really good for our people.
Thank you, Dean. That was really interesting. Again, another fantastic Indigenous insight of what's important for our people. And moving now on to our final speaker, and that's Fiona Cornforth. She's the CEO of the Healing Foundation, and that's our national body on healing. And they are doing some splendid work. So welcome, Fiona, and we're very interested to hear your insights and also to hear about the work that the fantastic Healing Foundation is doing.
Hello everybody, my name is Fiona Cornforth. I am the CEO at the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Healing Foundation. I'm a Wutiti woman from the far northeast Cape of Queensland, with family roots also in Zenotherkes, the Torres Strait Islands. I am grateful for this opportunity to share some thoughts and insights into some really important topics, and I hope you will take away what you need at this time and come back if you need more at a later stage. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the importance and impact of policy partnerships in closing the gap in health outcomes. And I wanted to point to the work of the National Health Leadership Forum. It's actually the National Indigenous Health Leadership Forum, and their work in particular in the development and ongoing implementation of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan, because that is just one front of mind example of the difference meaningful partnership and co-design can make. The National Health Leadership Forum is a group of First Nations controlled health and wellbeing bodies who have worked together for over a decade now to negotiate at the federal level for improved health policy outcomes through the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Plan. The health plan has established some really important policy precedents in First Nations leadership and shared decision making that I hope are being echoed across other government portfolios and partnership development processes, if not now, then in the immediate future. Through meaningful and sustained partnership, the health plan has made groundbreaking commitments. This has included recognising and addressing racism in the health system and centering culture and cultural determinants at the centre of the policy framework. It has led to the implementation of important initiatives such as the APRA standards that embed cultural safety measures across the health workforce, and overseen important gains in preventative health, including maternal and child health and investment in community-controlled health services. It has in place accountability measures through its governance, so that will be the National Health Leadership Forum and Implementation Working Group, and reporting mechanisms such as the Australian Institute in Health and Welfare dashboard. The work by the Coalition of Peaks too has continued to build on and around this model of putting Indigenous leadership at the decision-making table, recognising that we in fact haven't always known the answers and will continue to. Through the process of the national partnerships, we have been able to enter policy negotiations across portfolios, and this is necessary for the way that we understand good health. That good health requires cultural connection and activities. It requires better housing, it requires strong and happy families, and it requires language restoration. Healthcare and wellbeing doesn't happen at one service. It needs to happen across all the services in our communities. I'll move on now to the second topic, and that is strategies for strengthening collaboration between stakeholders to ensure the effective implementation of the national agreement. So through our work at the Healing Foundation, we know that trauma-aware, healing-informed practice is key to better ways of working with First Nations communities, workforces, and organisations. Following are some ways that we can apply these learnings to strengthen collaboration and implementation in policy partnership contexts. Firstly, empowering First Nations leadership by creating and holding space. Partnerships need to be about more than collaboration. Emphasis needs to be on creating space and holding space for First Nations leadership and decision-making. The Healing Foundation is proud to be an organisation led by the experiences and knowledge of stolen generation survivors and it's a privilege to walk with the knowledge and legacy that they have gifted us. We need greater faith and confidence by government in our leaders, our organisations and our communities. We can be led by them. We have everything to gain by being led by them and nothing to lose. Number 2 is no further harm. Partnerships and collaboration must do no further harm to First Nations participants. There must be an onus on both government partners and our organisations to walk together for shared outcomes and to ensure that we are not creating burnout or trauma, for example, or triggering for our communities and their representatives. There is that wraparound support, those cultural values that we can uphold in these processes that have always kept us safe and well. Creating safe spaces. So trauma-aware healing-informed practice, it does create safe spaces that celebrate and privilege culture as that source of strength and healing. It's also space where storytelling and yarning are understood as important ways, the most important ways of communicating, and it's upheld and honoured, not disrupted or dismissed. Our richness in knowledge and content is in our storying. And these spaces are also where First Nations ceremony and knowledge protocols and processes are upheld and incorporated throughout as a way of strengthening partnerships. And finally, acknowledging history, true history and truth-telling. Trauma-aware healing-informed practice and policy requires that we must acknowledge the power imbalances that have existed in policy-making spaces and that continue to exist. We must acknowledge that policy and government systems have caused trauma and continue to this day, both as a result of detrimental policies enacted on First Nations peoples, but also through the repeated failure of governments to listen and act with integrity when dealing with First Nations peoples who have long fought for change and not seen any action. For stolen generation survivors, this has too often been the case. We must acknowledge this history, learn from it, and change. The third topic now, it is overcoming challenges and barriers in policy partnerships and identifying best practice. Start with resourcing. Resourcing to First Nations organisations is one big barrier that governments must address. For years now, we've unsuccessfully called for an increase in funding to our organisation to recognise the increased demand placed on my role and the organisation to participate in policy partnerships. Put simply, this level of participation comes at a cost for us that we have to make up for in other ways. Partnerships at all levels of the system, partnerships must be reflected across all levels of organisations, including community-controlled organisations and mainstream services. An example of some partnerships that we have to demonstrate this approach includes Work Up Queensland, and that's a partnership we have with the Australian National Research Organisation on Women's Safety, known as NROSE, to centre First Nations leadership to an evidence-based approach to addressing workforce-related challenges and opportunities in the women's health, domestic, family and sexual violence sector of Queensland. Look to community. Good things are happening in communities, and we must do all we can to support local leadership and solutions. We must celebrate the healing power of the collective and collective decision-making and avoid policy process and decision-making that create competition and division amongst our organisations, communities and families. The fourth topic is on opportunities for innovation and co-design to address health disparities in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. As of this year, all stolen generation survivors are aged 55 and over and are eligible for aged care supports. The time is now for us to stand up and act. It's overdue, long overdue. We must put in place policies for stolen generation survivors and their families that provide the support and dignity that they deserve to be treated with by the aged care system. This includes urgent and prioritised access to health and wellbeing care to meet complex needs, much of which have been created through the trauma of forced removal from family, culture and country. Survivors and their descendants have told us time and time again what is needed, and that is for all governments to respond and act. They endured a monumental injustice that is yet to be responded to in a way that ensures that that the patterns of trauma, they end, that the cycles of trauma, they end. So investment in intergenerational healing, that trauma is a major source of reduced health and wellbeing outcomes. We must address and invest in intergenerational trauma and healing in each of our policies. We must centre it in our policy partnerships. There's too many millions of dollars being spent on huge programs that we had little to no input on, that do not recognise or address trauma in people, trauma in communities. Part of our work over the last few years has been working with states and communities on developing healing strategies. Through these processes of healing forums and strategies, communities can come to understand the cycles of intergenerational healing and create solutions. They do hold the answers. They've shown us this time and time again. We just need to invest and trust in them. They're the 4 topics wrapped up. I just want to take this time to again thank you for having me on to share my insights at this point on those topics and to contribute to the webinars. I wish you all well and invite any further questions or engagement via mailbox info@healingfoundation.org.au or community@healingfoundation.org.au. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Fiona, our final speaker, and I thought how you, the insights that you shared really brought everything together, so thank you very much for that. Look, everyone, I think that we've had these incredible different perspectives of what needs to happen to strengthen our healing, strengthen our social emotional well-being, and from very different areas of work as well. But I think that the big commonality is to ensure that our people have the opportunity to heal, to come together, to strengthen themselves, to sit proudly in a cultural identity as well. And that was the commonality throughout all the speakers. I'm really invigorated by the passion, and I think it's an exciting time for us to be working in the area. And finally, I'd like to thank all the speakers, and I'd like to thank Gayaa Dhuwi for making this webinar possible. And please watch the space. There will be other webinars, and either these great speakers and new ones sharing their insights again. So thank you, everyone, and stay safe.